I'm going to show you guys a few exercises that are great for horses at multiple stages of training or fitness. And they're especially good right now during the restrictions for COVID-19 because a lot of people are either bringing their horses back into work after a break, or they've been restricted to just essential exercise, and so they're trying to keep the horses fit, but they can't work them very hard. Or perhaps you're bringing a horse back into work in a normal year, in a normal off-season, coming back into spring, or bringing your horse back into work for whatever reason. And also a lot of these exercises can be done without getting your horse sweaty, so I know a lot of people don't want to sweat their horses up too much in the winter time, but they still benefit the horse in a lot of different ways. These poles are spaced about 12 feet apart, and the reason that I have them 12 feet apart is because they're also going to double as a canter bounce exercise, which we'll be doing in a moment. You could have this exercise as close together as 5 or 6 feet apart. It's also really beneficial. When you're doing this exercise, especially when it's closer together, it's really beneficial for the horse's body awareness, but at any distance apart, it's beneficial for their body awareness or proprioception. So any horses that have any neurological deficits, this would be an exercise, as long as your vet clears you to do so, that helps with that type of an issue. Again, with any issue that your horse has, it's important for your vet to clear the horse for an exercise program. So if you have any soundness or movement concerns with your horse, make sure your veterinarian clears you for an exercise program such as this one. This exercise can be done for any horse. I especially like it for older horses or as part of my warm-up before working a horse that's going to work a little bit harder. Or if I want to exercise a horse in a way that's a little more interesting, it's not as boring as just walking them around or lunging them around. And it gives them some additional benefits as well. Your rest in between those sets doesn't have to be standing around. In fact, it's more useful if you're walking, doing some backing up exercises, or maybe some turn on the forehand or other lateral movements on the ground. So one way to do this exercise as a figure 8, you can go straight over the poles, walking beside your horse, and of course you can also ride the horse over. It's important to let the horse go slowly and figure out where to put her feet. And don't be concerned if they knock the poles, that's all part of their learning. So you can go straight, do a circle one direction. I'll pick her walk up a little bit just to make it a little more exercise. And you can do this leaning on either side of the horse. Then I'll come straight over again, and then I'll circle about the same size the other way. So you could do it going straight, or you could do it with a diagonal line and make it a smaller figure 8. As they're stepping over the poles, especially when the poles get up to one of the higher settings, you're working the horse's joints through a greater range of motion, which is healthy for their joints. They're also having to use their muscles that stabilize themselves. They're having to work into some of those deeper back muscles. And use their abdominal muscles a little bit. So it's good for a horse that's off work to get them back into riding again. I'll show another variation now. So I'm going to go diagonally across, so I'm going to start at one end of the poles and go diagonally across to the other end. And then a smaller circle. You can encourage the horse to bend a little bit more on that small circle, and then you're going to go diagonally across again. Once they're used to it on the ground, you could also be riding the horse over the poles as well. So getting ready to use this exercise as a canter bounce. You would use your canter bounce for a horse that's further along in their fitness. So one that's already cantering over ground poles and also cantering over a single small raised pole. So you can change your setup and take one of the poles down or away. Make sure they can canter over the one pole first. And they should also be well versed in trotting over raised poles. Like dressage horses are many types of Western performance horses. Anytime your horse is involved in repetitive activities, same type thing all the time, same footing all the time, same movements all the time, they're more at risk for injuries. And so the more you can cross-train your horse and expose them to a variety of different movements, as long as you do it safely and progressively, it helps make your horse more resilient and more potentially resistant to injuries. So then you would go and do the same thing on the other side and compare what your horse does on one side versus the other. You can also lunge over at a walk as I'm doing here instead of just doing the figure eight. Again, you can ride over this exercise at all gaits as well, but I recommend getting the horse used to it on the ground first, and then they can get stronger before the rider's weight is added to them. Another benefit of this exercise is it gets the horse to strengthen the muscles of their hindquarters, as well as changing it up for the horse or cross-training, keeps them mentally fresh, helps to combat burnout, and helps prevent them from getting sour. And it's fun for the people too, it's fun for the rider. For the setup, these are 12-foot poles, and the distance that we're going to be trotting over is about 4 feet between the poles. It doesn't matter what distance you use as long as it's appropriate for your horse and what you're trying to achieve with your horse, and as long as they're symmetrical. So the distance between this pole and this pole, this pole and this pole, and this pole and that pole, they all need to be the same, because one of the benefits of the exercise is to encourage the horse to use symmetrical movement. Many horses want to use one hind leg differently than the other, so movements where poles have to encourage both hind legs to push and carry equally and stride equally are really, really helpful for training that horse to become more symmetrical. If you find that your horse is large, you may have to spread these apart a little more, or a very small horse or pony might be a little closer together. Also, if you're trying to encourage a longer stride or a shorter stride within your own horse's range, you can play with the spacing of the poles a little bit too. We're going to trot over. This is a little challenging for the lunger to hit the right spot. It's actually easier to ride over these poles. But again, if the horse is adapted to the poles on the ground, you can raise these poles. You can raise alternating ends. There's lots that you can do with this setup. So these poles are not spaced for walking, but having to pick their way over kind of random poles that aren't spaced perfectly for a walk is also useful for the horse's body awareness and makes them have to pay attention a little exercise, I would go 4 to 6 circles each direction, and you can do 2 or 3 sets of that. So you might do one round to the right, going over this 4 times, then have a walking break, do something else, and then repeat that same side 4 times, and then do the same thing on the other side, going left, going 4 times over, and then a break, and then 4 times over to the left. You can see at this height, this would be a more advanced progression. It's a lot more challenging for the horse, and you can see how much her joints are flexing, how high her legs are lifting. As well, you can see that she's thinking about where to place each foot, so it's good for that proprioception or body awareness. And just let them go slow. It's no big deal if they knock the poles. Eventually they'll get to the point where they're not knocking them anymore. So this is just me lunging her over and changing directions, not worrying so much about the figure 8. You can also pay attention to if the horse is favoring one limb, so if they're always reaching one leg first over the poles, try to set them up so they alternate the other limb. When you're doing this exercise or any exercises with the poles, it's also a good idea to pay attention to which limb the horse is reaching over the poles with first. If they're always leading with, say, their right front leg, try to set them up and encourage them to sometimes begin with the left front leg as they're walking over. And if the horse is going over crooked and you haven't asked for a diagonal line, there's still some benefit to the exercise as far as the body awareness and the joint range of motion, but symmetry is important too. So something like those trot poles that are evenly spaced is helpful for their symmetry. But you can try to help the horse go straighter, gently, without being too distracting, guide them a little bit straighter so that they're not loading one leg always more than the other. For example, always leaning on their left front leg and pushing their shoulder to the left, because that's going to be pervasive across your riding and cause you issues. And potentially, if a horse is always overloading one limb, it could lead to injury, so it's not going to be as beneficial if the horse is always doing things crookedly or asymmetrically. You want to watch out for those things.